So this video is about the OPEC oil embargo example. So we'll be connecting this with the Phillips and the narrow curves. So a quick overview. In 1973, an oil embargo was imposed against the US because of the Arab-Israeli war. The OPEC oil embargo banned exports of petroleum to the US and reduced the production of oil. The reduction in oil production caused the price of oil to increase dramatically. So before we continue, what curve on the AD/AS model, the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model, will get shifted because of this shock? So take a moment to think about it and fill out that question in your worksheet. Okay, so assuming that you paused the video and we're ready to move on, let's go see what the answer is. So here is our initial aggregate demand, aggregate supply curve. Here is our original long run equilibrium. Now, because we have a negative supply shock, right? Because there was a ban on exports to the United States, and also the prices of oil, which is usually an input, went up. We can assume that it's going to be a negative short run supply shock, or negative temporary supply shock. And so the supply curve, short run aggregate supply curve, will get shifted to the left. And that's the new blue one that we see right there. And E2 will be our new short run equilibrium. So E2 is where our current economy is at in this example. Now, let's see what's next. So the dual mandate, so the Federal Reserve has a dual mandate. Its goals are to keep prices stable and keep unemployment low. If the Federal Reserve sets an expansionary monetary policy, full employment can be achieved, but there will also be high inflation. If the Federal Reserve enacts a contractionary monetary policy, inflation will be reduced, but unemployment will increase. So as a result, the Federal Reserve must choose whether to fight inflation or unemployment. It cannot fight both when they're both high. So it has to make a tough choice. So in our example with the OPEC oil embargo, we're gonna look at how the Federal Reserve fought its way through this. So at first, the Federal Reserve chose to fight unemployment using an expansionary monetary policy. This increased inflation but kept unemployment at the same level. This is because the Phillips curve was shifted upward. Everyone in the economy expected more inflation, since the negative supply shock caused an increase in the price. As a result, many began to charge higher prices at every output level. The expansionary monetary policy, which is commonly used to fight a recession, only increased the ongoing inflation crisis. There was high inflation and high unemployment, and this is a phenomenon known as stagflation. So let's look at the aggregate demand, aggregate supply curve, and then we'll transition from here to the Phillips curve. So here, this is where we left off previously. Now, if we assume that we're going into an expansionary monetary policy, the aggregate demand curve is going to shift to the right. And so E3 is going to be our new short run equilibrium. And from what we already know about this type of model, the aggregate demand and aggregate supply model, we know that to get to the long run equilibrium, the short run aggregate supply curve is going to shift to the left, and E4 is going to be our long run equilibrium. Now, if you want to translate this to the Phillips curve, so at first we're going to plot our original equilibrium. So that's what we have here, E1. And remember your Phillips curve, that's going to be downward sloping. Now, if we move on to the next case, right, when we first shifted the supply curve to the left, basically in the aggregate demand and aggregate supply model over here, this is our level of full employment. Anything below that in output wise means that we have more unemployment. And if we go up in the vertical axis, we're going to have higher prices. So here in the Phillips curve, we see that the point is to the right of E1 because you have more unemployment, and it's also above it because we have a higher price. And because it's no longer on this curve anymore, it's going to shift the curve, Phillips curve upward. So that's kind of like the first shift that happens. Then, remember with the expansionary monetary policy, the aggregate demand curve got shifted to the right, and we have our new equilibrium E3. So we notice that the output level is to the right of the full employment level. So that means unemployment has gone down. So that's why E3 is to the left of E1 and E2. But it's at a higher price. And so that follows with the rule of the Phillips curve that inflation and unemployment are inversely related to each other. So E3 will be on the Phillips curve. So it's just the movement along this curve. Then, remember we talked about how the short-run aggregate supply curve would get shifted to the left to get to our long-run equilibrium. So that's where E4 comes from. But the main thing to note that is that from E3 we have a lot less unemployment, so more output, and at E4 we get shifted back to a period of full employment, so potential output. So it is technically lower output, so that's why E4 is to the right of E3 to indicate a higher unemployment level than E3. But if you notice, E1 and E4 will be very identical to each other in terms of the unemployment rate, and that's because they're both at the long run equilibrium. And then E4 is at a higher price level, so that's why it's the highest point on the Phillips curve. And so our Phillips curve shifts even more upward. So this is what's happening when we were talking about that the Phillips curve shifted upward when the Federal Reserve enacted an expansionary monetary policy. Now, using a contractionary monetary policy. So then the Federal Reserve attempted to correct inflation using a contractionary monetary policy. As a result, everyone stopped expecting that inflation would continue to increase. Many began to charge lower prices at every level of output. This caused the Phillips curve to shift downward. Thus, inflation decreased, but unemployment stayed roughly at the same level. So let's look at the uh, aggregate demand and aggregate supply curve. So this is where we left off, and I'm actually going to take off some of these curves. So we're only left with one of each curve. So we have our most recent aggregate demand curve and our most recent short-run aggregate supply curve, and our long-run aggregate supply curve hasn't changed at all. So this is so far we have E4 at the equilibrium, and it's the most recent equilibrium we have. Now, because we are enacting a contractionary monetary policy, the aggregate demand curve is going to get shifted to the left. And so that's what I've depicted here with the blue aggregate demand curve. And our short run equilibrium will be E5. Then, from what we know about this model, we know that the short run aggregate supply curve is going to shift to the right to go to the long run equilibrium. And that's what we see over here. And E6 is going to be our new equilibrium in the long run. So if we look at this in terms of the Phillips curve, we started off with E4, that's where we left off last time. For E5, it's at a lower output rate, so that means unemployment is at a higher rate, but also the price level is lower. So that kind of corresponds to the rule of the Phillips curve, where inflation and unemployment rate have an inverse relationship. And so it's just a movement along that curve. When the short run aggregate supply curve gets shifted, we notice that unemployment gets lower. It goes back to the natural unemployment rate that's indicated by the long run aggregate supply curve. So that's why E4 and E6 are at the same level of unemployment, but it's at a much smaller price level, so inflation is definitely decreased. So the Phillips curve has shifted downward. So this is why we were saying that the Phillips curve got shifted downward when the Federal Reserve used a contractionary monetary policy to correct the inflation. Now here is a graph from the book. So this is the graph we saw. This is basically a more detailed graph using dates and with more detailed numbers about how unemployment and inflation rates change throughout the years. But if you notice, um, in 1972 and 1979, the unemployment rate did not really change as much, only the inflation rate accelerated. Here, when the Fed used a contractionary monetary policy, the inflation rate dropped, so the Phillips curve shifted downward, but unemployment stayed the same from 1980 to 1985. So thank you for watching this video. I hope you learned something new.